Hey guys, it's Pastor Eric. I'm so excited to continue the series that we began last week, The Grudge. This series is all about letting go of the things that hurt us. Last week, Pastor Daniel talked about forgiving yourself, and we concluded that we must forgive ourselves, but we can't because we're not able to forgive our own debts. On the other hand, Jesus could and did. He offers us the forgiveness that we need to be able to let go of the things that hurt us. However, the bitterness and suffering we feel and see often leads us to look for blame outside of ourselves. We feel the weight of suffering and maybe even move past the self-resentment, and because of experiences in life, maybe with someone in the church who hurt you, or classmates that misrepresented faith in Jesus, or a hypocritical coworker who claimed to know Jesus, or some other bent-up form of Christianity, or a misunderstanding about who God is. You've shifted your blame and your resentment from yourself or from others toward God, who you believe to be the source. So if this is you, you might ask questions like, why would God allow me to experience what I've experienced? Why did he let my parents go through a divorce? Why did he allow the abuse that I experienced? Why does he allow job loss? Why is he not stopping the outbreak of this pandemic? And the result of our pain and these questions becomes a large and still mounting case against a supposed God who loves us so much that he sent his son. If he loves us so much, then why not stop the suffering that I am experiencing and have experienced in the past? I want to begin by answering this question by framing it. So picture with me a courtroom. On one side, you have the defendant who's been charged with a crime, and on the other, the prosecutor who is proving that the defendant is guilty. The defendant takes the stand by the judge, and he swears in and is now answering questions about the grievous crime that's taken place. The judge presides over this case. He makes a decision according to the evidence. Now, believe it or not, this courtroom is in every one of our minds. The way that we think about suffering and hurt that we have experienced goes to the core of our minds as soon as we're able to sit down and think about it. We take our seat at the front of the room. We hold the gavel and we make the decision of whether or not the defendant, God, is guilty of negligence, or even worse, responsible for the pain and suffering that we've experienced. The situation plays in our head. The tragic and unfair events present themselves one by one. The situation looks bleak for God. He seems really unfair in light of all that we've gone through. The defense that God has is probably like little verses that Christians often slap onto hard times. They appear to be like duct tape being applied to a ship with a gaping hole in its side. Things like, God's still on the throne, or all things happen for a reason, or God will use this, or God has a plan for your life. Then the prosecution of our pain, amplified by our bitterness, replays the situations that we've been through. The death of a loved one, the suffering that people around the world are facing, the devastation left after a fire, a hurricane, or a tornado, the pain of a friend or loved one stabbing you in the back. Quickly, the court rules that God is guilty. And that's that. We think we can just move on. Except it's not. If you've reached this verdict in the court of your mind, then you'll likely be openly angry with God or secretly baffled and disgusted while outwardly pretending everything is fine. If you're the pretender, then you haven't openly spoke of your grudge against God, but inwardly you've given up. It may show up in your lack of enthusiasm or commitment in other areas of life, but for the most part, you seem to have it all together on the outside. You may even attend a church or be active in serving. But when opportunities to be known and challenged arise, you are uncommitted. By your putting blame on God, you've put deep and thick roots of bitterness, ground them deeply in your heart, and it's ever becoming more and more like a stone than a heart of flesh. And then you just pretend like everything's okay. Inwardly, you're angry, confused, and bitter. But outwardly, you're happy, together, hopeful. The contradiction of everything in you is hidden except when you lash out in anger over something petty or become disinterested with conversations about faith. Like a tree that blows over in high winds, only to reveal rot on the inside. The storm of crisis in your life only reveals that the tree of your faith has become a shell on the outside, but inside is dead and rotten. Matthew 15, 10 through 21 kind of gets at this idea. whenever Jesus points out to the Pharisees, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, and within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanliness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." Holding on to a grudge is painful. It tears us down by silently infiltrating our core being, working from the inside to the outside. But we often become very proficient in the art of pretending. We learn how to do the everything is okay dance, and we dance alongside our spouses, our kids, our coworkers, our family, who are all dancing to the same rhythm of fake contentment and joy. When our commitment is to good appearances and saving face, we are brash and unloving with those who are closest to us. You can be sure that inside of us there lies an inconsistency. What's outside is not like what's on the inside. The alternative to these negative responses is what many Christians do out of not knowing what to do or not knowing the answer. They have faith. These Christians have the gift of faith. They don't know how or why it's true that God is right, but they know he's right. They've been blessed with this gift of faith. And these people are able to not understand and yet believe. They will likely be the people who are unharmed in the face of suffering. They boldly face life's most difficult situations without budging an inch into their doubt. Their confidence in God is sure, and suffering is all somehow a part of God's plan. If you have this wonderful gift of faith, know that not everyone does. And you have brothers and sisters in the church and outsiders who are watching you. How can your faith build them up or lead them to the feet of Jesus rather than leaving someone feeling ashamed and discouraged? We'll consider this. But what do you do if you don't fall into this category of having the gift of faith? How can you deal with the hard and inescapable questions in a way that makes sense and is not mere ignoring of the hard questions? The alternative is far different. It's less like putting a new coat of paint on a room, like many families probably have done in quarantine, and more like demolishing the house and constructing a new one in its place. God doesn't want you to give up or hide, but rather lean into the only one who knows and has paid for our griefs and sorrows. He's redeemed us, which means that he's bought us back through the work of his Son. So let's take a moment and look away from ourselves and focus on the self-giving love of God in this song. So it turns out we had the courtroom all wrong. We can see the problem clearly in the story of Job. Job faces the suffering that very few people face, and even fewer people face all at the same time. But for Job, he experiences suffering, and he experiences a lifetime of suffering all at one moment. In one horrible event, he loses everything: his house, his kids, his farm, his animals, and even at the end of all of this, his wife resentfully leaves him and tells him to just curse God and die. Job is left confused and hurt. Why would God allow this? What had he done to deserve it? This is what Job asks all throughout the book. But the answer throughout all of the book is nothing. Job is blameless. He's done nothing wrong. His friends, however, have some suggestions as to what he's done wrong. They say, well, maybe you have a hidden sin, or maybe you've neglected giving money to the poor. And then the very last friend even says, you don't need to question God. He's the ruler of the universe. Don't question his decisions. So at the end of lots of dialogue, finally God appears out of a whirlwind. And he says that he's going to answer Job's questions. He asks Job if he made the animals. He asks if he knows how the earth works. He asks if Job is familiar with how the design of the world is. Job sheepishly replies that he did not know what he was talking about, and he needed to stop talking. So, it seems that the courtroom of our minds has been turned upside down. It turns out that it's not for us to decide whether or not God is guilty, the creator of the universe, but for the creator to decide if we are guilty. We are not the judge. God, the creator, is. This may feel uncomfortable and perhaps even judgmental and rings of, "You're going to hell." But let me remind you that this courtroom, though it is now a correct picture, is not the full picture. This is kind of the picture that we get of God's answer to these questions in the story, but the full picture is developed later. God desires unwavering allegiance, and his ways are above our ways as well as his thoughts above our thoughts. Who can know the mind of God? But the picture of who God is, becomes all the more clear when we see God fully revealed whenever he takes on flesh as Jesus. So God sends his only son to come to this earth. Jesus undergoes the full range of human emotions, but he does so while also maintaining unwavering faith in God. The prophet Isaiah spoke of the Messiah as both the creator God, who has no beginning or end, embodied in a finite man, and the suffering servant, who dies in the place of those who reject him in order to win their freedom in the kingdom of God. But the prophet spoke of one who would come not only as the wonderful counselor, mighty God, and everlasting Father, also the one who would be despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He bore our grief and our sorrows. That's according to Isaiah 53 and Isaiah 9:6. When we get into the gospel, Jesus' life is vividly depicted as one who intimately knows emotional and physical suffering. Now, we're all familiar with the fact that Jesus physically suffered. The cross is iconically the most symbolic physical representation of Christianity. But we might not be as familiar with his emotional pain that he felt. But here are a few passages that show us that Jesus felt the pain that we feel. In John 11:32 through 35, it says, "Then Mary, when she came where Jesus was and saw him, fell at his feet, saying to him, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.' When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in the spirit and troubled. And he said, 'Where have you laid him?' They said to him, 'Lord, come and see.' Jesus wept." And then in Luke 19:41 through 42, it says, "And when he drew near to the city, he wept over it, saying, 'Would that even today you knew the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes.'" And then in Hebrews 5:7, we're given insight as to what happened whenever Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. It says, "In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard for his godly fear." This is the picture we get of Jesus. He's not sitting in the judge's seat, gavel in hand, waiting to condemn you. He instead leaves his throne, comes to us. He experiences our physical and emotional pain for us. And although it seemed that he would face the same tragic end that all humans face, he did not. Death, our greatest enemy, the one who deals the greatest pain and suffering in our lives, is defeated by Jesus' resurrection. He overcomes death and rises triumphantly as the one human worthy of being called good and getting the not guilty verdict. Because we can clearly see in Jesus that God is not distant, standing in heaven, looking at earth, going through the global pandemic of COVID-19 and simply saying, "Trust me," but rather entering into our mess, we know that he is sovereignly working in this mess to bring about good, but not in the sense that we often think, like prosperity. He is going to use the tragic events that are a part of a broken world to point his people toward a hope beyond the mess, and also to change the way that we think about our present situation. So how do we know that Jesus cares? We look at what he did. He came and took on our suffering when he died on the cross, when he overcame suffering by his resurrection. Let's meditate on this mystery of love by singing together now. Through the story of Job, we learned that we've been looking at things the wrong way the whole time. It's not we who are in charge of truth, And it's not we who are in charge of our future, but rather God is. This is a huge shift in thinking. A similar shift in thinking took place 500 years ago with a guy named Nicholas Copernicus. For the 1500 years before Copernicus, people had all pretty much thought the same thing about the way that our solar system worked. And that was that not the sun is the center of the universe, but rather the earth is the center of the universe. It's called a geocentric view of the universe. What Copernicus did was a lot of complex math and a lot of mapping the stars and the planets, and he realized that what everyone else had thought for 2,000 years was wrong. Now, this is hard to believe because as a casual observer looking up at the sky during the day and then at night, it looks like everything just kind of spins around us. And this is why they had always thought it. But Copernicus changed everything whenever he released his book saying that the sun was the center of the universe. Now, once people who were in the exact same field began to study what Copernicus had said, they realized that they were wrong about this thing the whole time. Now, you can imagine how upsetting this would be. If you had given your life to this type of work, you'd been mapping the stars, you'd been mapping the planets and how things are moving in the universe, and you're doing a lot of similar math, like putting your life's work into the wrong system. And then you realize that Copernicus is right, and everything you've done is really a waste. This is similar to what we have to go through in our shift in thinking. It's not easy, but the courtroom of our mind is completely different than the way that we thought it was. As it turns out, there's another person in the courtroom, one who intimately knows our situation and actually takes our condemnation and our suffering upon himself. God the Father sees our failures and sees how we have experienced suffering, but also contributed to that suffering by acting out of hate, by making decisions with selfishness, by considering ourselves more important than others. All of these things, the evil we are so angry with, and the evil that we've always looked around and we've said, God, why do you allow this evil, is actually the same evil that's inside of us. And it's the same evil that we spread around in the relationships that we come in contact with. We are guilty. We're condemned to death. But Jesus steps in and he changes all of this. He suffers with us and for us. He knows our suffering and feels the grief of emotional and physical pain, yet he never sins. He never fails. He never gives up. He never gives in to bitterness or hate. He lovingly gives his life for ours. And after 3 days, he's raised from the dead by the power of the Holy Spirit, and through his conquering death, he is declared king over all of the creation. He is God, and he is on our side. The punishment that was supposed to be an end actually becomes a beginning. And he welcomes all who join him in faith to enter into his kingdom that goes beyond judgment, beyond suffering, and beyond heartache, into a kingdom that is unshakable because it's not a kingdom in this world. That's what we have to trust that Jesus has done. This is our hope beyond the suffering. But on the other side of this, we also have to realize that just because we know the answer doesn't mean that we need to dismiss people's suffering. People are suffering through real and very hard things. And it must be remembered that Jesus felt our pain, even though he knew that God was in control, and even though he knew that God had a plan for his life, and even though he knew that God's ways were different than our ways. That didn't mean that Jesus didn't cry out in prayer and weep bitterly for his friends and feel great sorrow with the way the world was. Paul illustrates this well in his care for the church in Thessalonica. He says this in 1 Thessalonians 2:2. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. We were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil, we worked night and day that we might not burden any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. And then skipping down to 1 Thessalonians 4:13, we pick up there and it says, brothers and sisters, we don't want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, those who have died, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind, who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep, died, in him. According to the Lord's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven, and with a loud command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. Paul clearly places the hope of Jesus' return and his restoration of this world as the answer for suffering. And it's the answer, but it's equally clear that Paul didn't rush in with the hope. He sat with them in the pain. It says that he came to them in the midst of much conflict and caring deeply for them. He shared not just the gospel, but his very life, caring for them like a mother cares for her children. Paul was not quick to offer answers and hoping that just everybody would figure out their problems and just come to know Jesus. He and the other missionaries that he was with lived beside them in the midst of the conflict. We must not offer little encouragements and easy answers. Rather, we must sit with our brothers and sisters and those who are seeking answers in the suffering. So let's go back to that courtroom. God is on the stand, and it turns out that he isn't deciding whether or not you're good enough, or whether you have all the answers, or whether or not you've understood why everything's happened the way that it did. He simply is looking to see if you're with Jesus or not. Jesus' suffering, his faithfulness, his conquering this world is yours when you trust that despite not understanding everything, despite the pain, you trust the one who does understand and who has overcome. Through Jesus, we are understood. We are loved, and we are promised a hope beyond the suffering. The logical answer to why we're suffering is not easy. It comes in perfectly packaged little verses and truths we like to quote, but the full answer is messier. It might look like conversations that range from tears to angry frustration. It might look like staying on the phone way longer than expected. It might look like prayers that are filled with questions, groanings, but it will never look like holding all of our grief and our pain inside and doing our best at pretending. The hope that Jesus offers is not a short-term fix, like a stimulus check that helps us for a week. It's the hope of eternity. It's forever. So let's not rush into comfort. Let's not seek out the quick fixes for our deep emotional pain. Instead, let's bear one another's burdens. Let's talk through the difficult situations and be led to the truth that, one, we are not alone in our suffering. Jesus suffered with us and for us. And then two, Jesus isn't okay with our suffering. He's not far away from us, looking down and just looking with pity. He experienced our suffering and stepped in the place of our suffering for us. Lastly, Jesus is going to come again, and he's going to make all things new. His resurrection was the beginning of the new creation, and we eagerly await the hope that everything sad, everything wrong with the world will be made new in the same way.